In terms of the kingdom of God, Jesus took over the hope of the Jewish people and gave it a new focus. He radicalized the message of the kingdom of God by proclaiming that the kingdom was not just something for the end times, but that the kingdom was being fulfilled now. And that's an essential part of the Christian message that has often been forgotten. Jesus didn't preach that the kingdom of God would be available to good, faithful folk after they died. Rather, the radical message of Jesus is that the kingdom of God is at hand. That is, that the kingdom of God is among you, now or near. There are different translations. In other words, that the kingdom of God is not something for the future, but for the present. Jesus compounded the radical nature of his message by the sort of person he was and the sorts of people he gathered around him. To the outside observer, it seemed that Jesus was an obscure rabbi from a very obscure part of Israel. He gathered around him a motley crew of disciples who were mostly poorly educated. In fact, the only one who seemed to be well educated was Judas. His followers included people of poor repute, tax collectors, prostitutes, notorious sinners. So here was Jesus, proclaiming the kingdom of God, who was surrounded by the people that society rejected, the poor, the weak, religious and social outlaws. To the outsider, it seemed to be a rather strange inauguration of the kingdom of God. But these followers of Jesus, and the fact it was these people, the rejects of society, rather than respected members of the establishment, it was these people who embraced the kingdom. It shows the radical nature of the kingdom of God. Now, we may have read the parables of Jesus and the kingdom, and examples that he used, parables he taught, that the kingdom of God was like a seed that grows into a great plant, such as the mustard seed that grows into the greatest of trees. Now, it helps again to engage in cross-cultural thinking. When we think of growth like that, so if we think of a seed becoming a great tree, we think in terms of organic growth. It seems natural to us today with our scientific mindset that a seed will grow into a tree. But that sort of thinking was alien to the people of the ancient Middle East. They had a miraculous view of the world. Between a seed that was planted and the tree that grew, they didn't see natural development, they saw contrast. And instead of natural growth, they saw the divine miracle of life. So when Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God, and when he spoke of it as being something that was like a seed growing into a tree, he meant to say that the kingdom of God was radical, new, and unexpected. It was a miraculous institution of the reign of God. But there's a contradiction here. Jesus proclaims that the kingdom of God is near, at hand, or even present. But doesn't Jesus also make it clear that the kingdom of God is coming? That's one of the petitions of the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come." The problem we face here, though, is another cross-cultural one. We are accustomed to thinking of time in quantitative terms. We think in terms of minutes, hours, days, months, years. Our focus today is on measuring time. The biblical notion of time, though, is not quantitative the way that we think about it. Rather, biblical time is qualitative, measuring not the hours, minutes, and seconds, but qualitative time is what that time stands for. So an example I often use is that when we think about time today, we usually think in terms of it is 6 p.m. in the evening. That's quantitative time. Qualitative time is saying, now it's time for dinner. This is what the time is for. That sort of notion of time is captured from the text of Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season, and time for every matter under heaven, a time for planting, a time for uprooting, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time for mourning and a time for dancing. That's a very different notion of time to our notion of time today. And I'd also add it's very similar to the notion of time that we find in many indigenous cultures today. So the timing of the kingdom needs careful cross-cultural interpretation. What did Jesus mean in terms that make sense to us today? The message of Jesus is that the time for the coming of the kingdom of God has begun, and that human beings have a radical choice to make. The kingdom of God is the power that controls the future or the fulfillment of all human beings. The kingdom of God is salvation to the person or the people that see their future within the kingdom of God. In other words, the kingdom of God is judgment to those who don't accept the presence of God, but it is salvation to those who accept it. The kingdom of God is freedom to those who embrace it, but judgment to those who reject it, or to those who have ambitions that lay outside of the just rule of the kingdom. So this is another important aspect of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God isn't forced upon people. People are invited into God's kingdom, but they are not coerced into entering it. The message of Jesus is that the kingdom of God is at hand, and it is a firm and final offer that demands decision, for or against. The offer is left to people. They can accept it, or they can reject it.